Connie Margarotta Dabate was born on July 31, 1976, in Rockville, Connecticut. She was the youngest child of Kenneth and Cindy Margarotta. Her brother Keith would later say that he still remembered the day their father brought him to the hospital to see his baby sister for the first time. The nurse held her up to the window, and from that moment, she became the light of their family. Growing up in Vernon and Ellington, Connie excelled in everything she touched. She graduated from Ellington High School in 1995, then went on to earn her undergraduate degree from the University of Connecticut in 1999. Friends described her as someone who threw herself into life with infectious enthusiasm. After university, Connie built an impressive career in pharmaceutical sales. She worked for several companies before joining Reckitt Benckiser as a pharmaceutical sales representative, where she quickly established herself as a top performer. Her LinkedIn profile would later show she was in the top 20% of the company consistently and had earned 3 President's Club awards. She wasn't just successful, she was passionate about her work and took pride in being a resource for the physicians and pharmacists she served. But for all her professional achievements, Connie's greatest joy came from her family. On July 4, 2003, she married Richard Dabate, a computer network administrator she'd been dating for several years. Richard was 2 years younger than Connie and had quite a different personality. Friends described him as having an offbeat humor and being somewhat quirky. Where Connie was outgoing and warm, Richard was more reserved and technical. The couple settled into their 4-bedroom colonial-style home at 7 Birchview Drive in Ellington, worth around $634,000 at today's market prices. Soon, their family grew with the arrival of 2 sons, Richard E. Jr., RJ, born in 2006, and Connor, born in 2009. For Connie, motherhood was everything. When Connor was born with a cleft lip requiring ongoing medical treatment, she became his devoted advocate, driving him back and forth to Boston for doctor's appointments while simultaneously caring for her father, who was battling leukemia. Friends said that despite all her professional success, Connie's proudest accomplishment was being a loving and devoted mother. Around their neighborhood, Connie had earned the nickname the sunshine of so many lives. She was actively involved in the Ellington Ambulance Corps, where she served as vice president for many years. She organized fundraisers, delivered meals to sick neighbors, and was always the first to volunteer when help was needed. Neighbors described her as someone who made their community feel like a family. To those looking from the outside, the Dabates seemed to have it all. They lived in their beautiful home, both had successful careers, Connie being the primary breadwinner, and they were raising 2 healthy, happy boys. Friends described them as a normal couple with the typical marital disagreements most couples experience, often centering around money and spending habits. But as investigators would later discover, beneath this perfect facade lay a web of deception that would ultimately lead to unimaginable tragedy. By 2015, while the Dabate family appeared happy from the outside, there were warning signs that all was not well. Those closest to Connie began to notice she seemed more stressed than usual, particularly about the family's finances. Richard had developed spending habits that concerned her. He had been known to take money from accounts without discussing it with his wife. And there were charges for things like visits to a local strip club that raised questions. But the most damaging secret Richard was keeping wasn't about money at all. It was about Sarah Ganser, a woman he had known since junior high school in Manchester. Sarah had her own history with Richard. They had brief romantic encounters in 2005, 2007, and 2008, all while he was married to Connie. After Sarah's own divorce in 2014, she moved back to Manchester, and she and Richard reconnected as friends. By May 2015, their friendship had evolved into something much more serious. They began a physical relationship, and just 1 month later, in June, Sarah discovered she was pregnant with Richard's child. When Richard learned about the pregnancy, he assured Sarah that he was planning to divorce Connie and that they could build a future together. Sarah would later testify that she never pushed Richard for a divorce and never wanted to break up the Dabate family. She planned to raise the child on her own if necessary, but Richard kept making promises about leaving his wife that he never seemed to follow through on. In June, he told Sarah he was preparing for divorce and even claimed to be fixing up the house to get it ready for sale. By August, he had changed his tune, telling Sarah he was thinking about staying with Connie. Then, in November, once again, he claimed he and Connie were on the same page about getting divorced. The constant back and forth was exhausting for Sarah, who was now 7 months pregnant and trying to plan for her future. She would sometimes shut Richard out or tell him to leave her alone, but he always found his way back into her life with new promises and reassurances. Meanwhile, Connie remained completely unaware of the affair and the pregnancy. To her, the marriage seemed to be going through a rough patch, but nothing insurmountable. In November 2015, she even sent Richard romantic text messages, including a photo of herself in lingerie with the message, "I'm ready for you, big boy." But Richard was living in two worlds. The very day before Connie sent that intimate message, he texted Sarah to assure her that he and his wife had talked about the divorce and were on the same page. 2 days later, he told Sarah they were getting a slow-moving divorce to make it easier on the kids. Friends and family who knew Connie said she never spoke about getting divorced. If anything, she seemed committed to working through whatever problems they were having. State police would later interview nearly 20 witnesses, and most said the same thing. Connie never mentioned divorce, though some noted she seemed stressed about Richard's spending habits. What Connie did know, however, was that something in her life was causing her significant anxiety. On the morning of December 23, 2015, at 8:58 a.m., she sent a Facebook message to a psychotherapist requesting a hypnosis appointment because there's a lot going on right now. She never got the chance to keep that appointment. Richard, meanwhile, was feeling the pressure from all sides. His cousin, Lori Gardner, would later testify that at a party in summer 2015, Richard had confided in her about Sarah's pregnancy. He was worried about what his family would think when they found out and feared becoming the black sheep of the family. His best friend, Seth Robertson, said Richard had voiced concerns about divorce, believing that men were at a disadvantage and that women typically got to keep the house and custody of the children. The walls were closing in on Richard Dabate. Sarah was 7 months pregnant with his child and growing frustrated with his empty promises. His finances were strained, and a divorce would mean losing the comfortable lifestyle he had built with Connie's successful career. He was facing the prospect of custody battles, alimony payments, and the social MB. Harassment of his infidelity, being exposed to his friends and family. Something had to give, and Richard Dabate was about to make a choice that would destroy multiple lives forever. December 23, 2015, started like any other Wednesday morning for the Dabate family. The boys, 9-year-old RJ and 6-year-old Connor, were preparing for school, excited about the Christmas holidays that would begin in just 2 days. Connie had plans to attend her regular spinning class at the Indian Valley YMCA in Ellington, something she did religiously to maintain her fitness. Richard told police he left the house between 8:30 and 8:40 that morning to head to work at his job as a computer network administrator. According to his statement, he drove about 5 minutes before realizing he had forgotten his laptop at home, so he turned around to retrieve it. But digital evidence would later reveal a very different story about Richard's movements that morning. At 8:26 a.m., Facebook was accessed from the Dabate home computer. At 8:37 a.m., someone conducted a Google search for long-lasting tattoo ideas from the same computer, nearly 10 minutes after Richard claimed to have left for work. At 8:46 a.m., Connie's Fitbit registered that she was leaving the house for her spinning class. The device, a Fitbit one she wore clipped to her hip, meticulously tracked every step she took from that moment forward. At 8:47 a.m., something crucial happened. The home alarm system was armed from Richard's keychain fob, a device that only worked within 500 feet of the house. Almost immediately afterward, someone tried to disarm the same alarm system using Richard's mobile phone. The attempt failed at first, but at 8:51 a.m., the system was successfully disarmed from the phone and then rearmed again. This sequence of events would prove to be critical evidence. Richard's keychain fob could only arm the system if he was physically at or very near the house. The immediate attempt to disarm it from his phone suggested he was trying to manage the alarm remotely after leaving, but the timing sucked. Who did he was still at home when he claimed to be driving to work? At 8:53 a.m., security cameras at the YMCA captured Connie's arrival. She appeared her usual cheerful self, ready for her morning workout. But when she got inside, she discovered her spinning class had been canceled. The cameras showed her leaving again at 9:08 a.m., much earlier than expected. Back at the house, digital forensics would later show that at 9:18 a.m., someone visited the YMCA website from Richard's computer. This suggested he might have been checking to see if Connie had actually gone to her class, or perhaps monitoring when she might return home. At 9:23 a.m., Connie's garage door opened. As she returned home unexpectedly, her Fitbit recorded this movement, logging the moment she stepped out of her car and entered her house for the final time. For the next 17 minutes, Connie's Fitbit showed normal activity patterns. At 9:40 a.m., she posted a video to Facebook from inside the house. 6 minutes later, she posted another video. These posts, accessed from the family's home internet connection, proved she was alive and actively using her phone. But what happened next would change everything. At 10:05 a.m., Connie's Fitbit recorded her final steps, 1,217 feet of walking throughout her house. This was far more than the approximately 125 feet between her car and the basement where she would later be found. The device showed she had been moving around the house normally, perhaps doing household tasks or getting ready for the day ahead. Then, at exactly 10:05 a.m., the Fitbit went silent forever. 7 minutes later, at 10:12 a.m., the home's panic alarm was activated from Richard's keychain fob. It was the only time that morning the panic alarm had been used. Richard would later tell police that he had received alerts about the alarm while driving and had emailed his boss to say he was returning home to check on a security issue. But phone records showed that Richard's mobile phone was pinging off cell towers near his house throughout the morning, contradicting his claim that he was miles away at a bus depot in Broadstone, where he said he was checking advertising displays. When first responders arrived at 7 Birchview Drive, they found a scene that would haunt them forever. Richard was discovered on the kitchen floor, partially bound to a metal folding chair with zip ties. He had superficial wounds to his legs and torso and immediately launched into his account of what had happened. He told them a shocking story of encountering a masked intruder dressed in camouflage with a voice like Vin Diesel, who had been rummaging through Connie's jewelry in their bedroom closet. The intruder, Richard said, had demanded money and credit card PIN numbers, which Richard claimed he provided. When Connie returned home early and Richard shouted for her to run, she had inexplicably run to the basement instead of escaping. The intruder had followed her there, struggled with her, and shot her twice with a gun Richard had purchased just 2 months earlier. In the basement, investigators found Connie's body. She had been shot twice with a .357 Magnum revolver, once in the back of the head and once in the stomach. It was a weapon that had never been fired before that day, and it bore no identifiable fingerprints. Experienced investigators immediately noticed problems with Richard's story. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. In fact, money that should have been attractive to a burglar was left untouched. Most tellingly, 3 separate police K9 units brought in to track the intruder's scent all failed to pick up any trail leading away from the property. The first dog, Rocky, kept circling back to Richard and even tried to jump into the ambulance with him. The scene looked staged, and Richard's behavior seemed odd for someone who had just witnessed his wife's murder. But it would take months of meticulous digital forensics to prove what investigators suspected from the very beginning. Richard Dabate had killed his wife and tried to make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. What Richard hadn't anticipated was how thoroughly modern technology would document every aspect of his deception. The Connecticut State Police Eastern District Major Crime Squad, working with prosecutor Matthew Gdansky, conducted one of the most comprehensive digital forensics investigations in the state's history. The centerpiece of their case was Connie's Fitbit 1 device. The hip-worn fitness tracker had been recording her movements with scientific precision right up until her death. Dr. Keith Diaz from Columbia University Medical Center, who had conducted extensive research on Fitbit accuracy, testified that when worn on the hip, the devices were nearly perfect at measuring steps, 98% accurate for walking and jogging. The Fitbit data revealed fatal flaws in Richard's timeline. He claimed Connie had been killed around 9:05 a.m. shortly after she returned home from the gym, but her Fitbit showed she was still actively moving around the house until 10:05 a.m., a full hour later. During that time, the device recorded 1,217 feet of movement, which Dr. Diaz testified were incidental movements, the kind you'd expect from someone doing normal household activities, not running for their life from an intruder. Even more damning was the home alarm system data. The sophisticated security system maintained detailed logs of every arming and disarming event, complete with timestamps and the method used. whether keychain fob or mobile phone. The logs showed Richard had been physically present at the house throughout the morning, repeatedly arming and disarming the system, despite his claims of being miles away at work. At 9:04 a.m., Richard had sent an email to his supervisor from the home computer, claiming he was returning to check on a security alert, but phone data showed he was already at home when he sent that message, not driving from a bus depot 2 miles away as he claimed. His computer activity that morning painted a picture of someone who was very much at home and very much aware of what was happening. Beyond the Facebook visits and Google searches, Microsoft account records showed multiple logins from the home IP address throughout the morning, corresponding exactly with times when Richard claimed to be elsewhere. Investigators also discovered disturbing internet searches on Richard's computer from the months leading up to Connie's murder. In July and September 2015, he had searched for deadly over-the-counter pill combinations, fast untraceable homemade poison, tasteless poison easily available, and detailed information about ricin. These searches suggested the murder had been planned for months, not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. But perhaps most heartbreaking was Connie's own digital trail on her final morning. Her Facebook activity showed she had no idea what was coming. At 8:58 a.m., she messaged a psychotherapist about feeling anxious because there's a lot going on right now. At 9:40 a.m. and 9:46 a.m., she posted cheerful videos to Facebook, appearing relaxed and content in her own home. The phone data also revealed the extent of Richard's deception about his affair. He had been in constant contact with Sarah Ganser, making 8 calls to her on the day of the murder alone, including a 28-minute conversation that morning, something he had initially failed to mention to police. When confronted with this overwhelming digital evidence, Richard's story began to crumble. He admitted to the affair and to lying about his whereabouts, but maintained his innocence regarding the murder. He claimed he had lied because he was terrified and trying to protect his reputation. But investigators had one more piece of damning evidence. After Connie's murder, Richard behaved in ways that struck everyone as deeply inappropriate for a grieving widower. Just 5 days after his wife's death, he attempted to claim her $475,000 life insurance policy. When that was denied due to the ongoing investigation, he withdrew over $90,000 from Connie's investment accounts. Most shocking of all, by the time of his eventual conviction in 2022, Richard had depleted virtually all of Connie's estate, the money she had worked hard to save for their sons' futures. The boy's aunt testified that only $624 remained of their mother's savings, not even enough to buy a shirt, shoes, or a backpack. The digital evidence was overwhelming, and it told a clear story. Richard Dabate had murdered his wife in their home sometime between 10 a.m. and 10:05 a.m. on December 23, 2015, then staged an elaborate home invasion to cover his tracks. For nearly 18 months after Connie's murder, Richard Dabate maintained his innocence and lived as a free man while police painstakingly built their case. He continued his relationship with Sarah Ganser, who gave birth to their daughter in February 2016, less than 2 months after Connie's death. During this time, Richard's behavior continued to raise red flags among those who had known the couple. Neighbors found it extremely strange that just days after his wife's murder, he was texting them, asking about favorite takeout restaurants. His apparent lack of grief, combined with his immediate focus on financial matters, painted a picture of a man more concerned with covering his tracks than mourning his wife. Friends who had once supported Richard began to distance themselves. His best friend, Seth Robertson, described meeting with Richard several weeks after Connie's death, expecting to console a grieving widower. Instead, Robertson said, "Richard gave me a basic account of the murder that seemed rehearsed, then quickly moved on to talking about everyday things as if nothing had happened. I showed up with pockets of tissues, and it never happened," he testified. Robertson said there was none of the sadness or anger he expected from someone who had just lost their wife. Meanwhile, Connie's family was struggling to process their loss while growing increasingly suspicious of Richard. Connie's mother had noticed his strange behavior from the very beginning, particularly his odd detachment when viewing Connie's body and his comment that they could put the lid on it now when speaking about her coffin, as if he were talking about a tin box, not his wife's final resting place. The investigation was exhaustive. Police interviewed over 20 witnesses, analyzed thousands of digital records, and worked with FBI specialists in fields from computer forensics to fitness tracker data to ensure every piece of evidence was documented. On April 14, 2017, police finally had enough evidence to act. Richard was arrested at his mother's house and charged with murder, tampering with physical evidence and making false statements to police. When Detective Sergeant Pat Murray placed a hand on Richard's shoulder and told him he was under arrest, he later said the blood drained from his face and he went white as a sheet. He was not expecting it. Richard pleaded not guilty to all charges and was released on $1 million bail, with his family leveraging 5 homes as collateral to secure his freedom. This meant he could remain free for another 5 years while the case worked its way through the courts. As they waited for the trial to begin, the family watched in horror as Richard continued to spend Connie's money. He withdrew thousands from her accounts, supposedly for living expenses and legal fees, while her children, the rightful beneficiaries of her estate, lived with relatives who had taken them in out of love and duty. The trial, first set for March 2020, was repeatedly delayed, first by the pandemic, then by Richard's attorney's death in 2021, and again in 2022 when a new jury had to be selected. Sarah Ganser, meanwhile, had ended her romantic relationship with Richard but continued to co-parent their daughter. Richard Dabate's trial began on April 5, 2022. The prosecution presented over 600 pieces of evidence, with the Fitbit data proving Connie was alive for an hour after Richard claimed she'd been killed. Sarah Ganser's testimony provided the crucial motive evidence. Fighting back tears, she described her 30-year relationship with Richard and how he had repeatedly promised to divorce Connie. She testified that she had never demanded he leave his wife, but had grown frustrated with his constant changes of heart. Her pregnancy had put enormous pressure on Richard to make a decision about his future, pressure that the prosecution argued had driven him to murder. Even at sentencing, Richard maintained his innocence. "I am here as an innocent man," he said. "I will never stop seeking justice for my wife, Connie, who I love and think of every day." His words rang hollow to those who had heard months of evidence about his lies, his affair, and his theft of his wife's estate. On May 10, 2022, the jury found him guilty on all charges. At sentencing, the devastating financial betrayal was revealed. Richard had spent virtually all of Connie's estate, leaving her sons with just $624. Judge Karen Klatt sentenced him to 65 years in prison. Connie's brother, Keith Margarotta, said the conviction brought relief. "It's a weight lifted off my shoulders, but it's bittersweet. Everything we went through 6 years ago is right in front of us right now." Her mother, Cindy Margarotta, struggled to speak through tears as she described losing her youngest child. "I just feel this surge from up above. I feel this strength coming to me right now, through all of us. She's here." The Connecticut Supreme Court upheld his conviction in January 2025, cementing it as landmark precedent for fitness tracker evidence. Richard remains at McDougall Walker Correctional Institution with a MA, Zymum release date of May 2, 2087. The 2 boys now live with their aunt. But the community Connie had served so generously established a college fund to help secure their future, a testament to the woman they remembered as the sunshine of so many lives. Her Fitbit may have been the silent witness that exposed her killer, but Connie's true legacy lives on in those who knew her kindness. Her family wants her remembered not for how she died, but for the light she carried. In the end, it was Connie herself who helped bring her killer to justice. As her family said, "Please don't forget Connie.